When it comes to discussing optimal mobility versus, I guess, stability, we have people that tend to be hypermobile, which they have excessive mobility in a joint, and then we have people that tend to be hypomobile, so they have low mobility in a joint. As a rule of thumb, if you have excessive mobility in a joint, typically you want to restrict the range of motion a little bit, because just to stabilize that joint. So for example, you have someone that has excessive range of motion in the shoulder joint, if they're doing a dumbbell pressing, for example, I'll tend to keep them slightly within a lesser range just so they can maintain stability through that range, okay? Because the thing is, if you're too mobile, you're going to compromise stability of the joint. So if you're too mobile, you need to then focus on developing strength. On the other hand, if your mobility is lacking, you're not going to get optimal development of that muscle group when you train it. And on the other hand, you also, if you don't have strength in the end range of motion, so if you don't have optimal range of motion, you're not going to recruit as many muscle group or motor units, you're not going to create as much metabolic stress, you're not going to do as much work, okay? So in that case, you want to focus more on improving mobility, okay? And the other thing you need to know here is the muscle group that reaches a stretch threshold first is the one that's going to do the most work. So if you're doing a compound movement, the muscle group that's tightest is generally going to end up doing the most work, okay? So over time, you can end up developing muscle imbalances because then your tighter muscle groups end up taking more of the workload, and your weaker muscle groups end up getting weaker, your stronger muscle groups end up getting stronger. So you're actually exacerbating that imbalance. So in that case, it's, you need to focus on improving the mobility in those areas so that you can strengthen that movement through the entire range. Now, sometimes, as a rule of thumb, muscles that tend to be hypermobile tend to be weak, and muscles that tend to be hypomobile tend to be what we call hypertonic. They tend to be overactive, those muscles. But that's not always the case. There are instances where you get a muscle that's both hypotonic, so it's underactive, and it's tight as well. So for example, take the hip flexor. It's common to have, for a lot of individuals, tight hip flexors. Because of that, a lot of people will spend a lot of time stretching the hip flexors, and they'll never do any type of strength work because they assume this muscle is tight, it's also going to be overactive. But that's not always the case. I've seen in a lot of individuals, they'll actually have tight but also weak hip flexors. And the reason is because if a muscle is weak, especially it's weak at the extremes, what the brain will do is will send signals to inhibit that muscle to keep it within the range where it has strength and where it has motor control. So in that instance, if you have a muscle that's both weak and tight, you need to actually first strengthen the muscle. Because what happens is if you just focus on mobility, you're actually going to destabilize the joint even more. So in that case, first you focus on getting the muscle strong, then you focus on the mobility after that. Because a lot of times, and I've seen this happen, if you get the muscle strong, the mobility will come with it. Because once the brain perceives that it's safe to take a muscle into that range, it will release it and you allow it to get into there. So in that case, strength comes first, then mobility.